In the shadow of medieval Europe, where death was an ever-present companion, one figure loomed larger than most: the plague doctor. With their long beak masks and dark, flowing robes, these mysterious individuals seem more like creatures of nightmare than the bearers of care. But who were they really? And why did they appear during the darkest chapter of Europe's history, when the Black Death swept across the land, leaving nothing but death and despair in its wake? The role of the plague doctor is often misunderstood, reduced to nothing more than a peculiar figure in history books. However, the truth behind their existence is far more complex and fascinating than most realize. The origins of the plague doctor are tied to the devastating events of the 14th century, particularly the pandemic that killed millions. The Black Death, as it was called, was a disease that ravaged Europe, its cause unknown and its symptoms horrifying. The medical establishment at the time was in its infancy, based largely on superstition and vague theories. Against this backdrop, the plague doctors were appointed as the designated healers during outbreaks, tasked with diagnosing, treating, and containing the disease. At first glance, the doctor's attire, a beaked mask filled with aromatic herbs, thick robes, gloves, and boots, seems to be little more than a bizarre medieval superstition. The masks were believed to protect them from bad air, or miasma, which was thought to carry disease. But could there have been more to these strange practices than superstition? Could the plague doctors, despite their rudimentary understanding of disease, have stumbled upon something more profound, something about immunity or disease resistance that was lost to time? As we peel back the layers of history, the mystery of the plague doctor only deepens. What if these doctors weren't simply acting out of ignorance, but were perhaps clinging to a forgotten truth about disease and immunity, one that we may have long since forgotten? What if their strange remedies and masks held the key to unlocking an ancient understanding of how the body defends itself? The plague doctors weren't just victims of their time. They were trying to manage a crisis with what little knowledge they had, working under the shadows of disease and fear. In doing so, they may have unwittingly preserved insights that would echo through the centuries, lying dormant until we were ready to understand them. And with that, we begin our journey into the world of the plague doctor, where secrets may lie hidden in plain sight, waiting to be rediscovered. From here, we'll delve deeper into the devastating plague itself, examining the terror that gripped Europe and how it shaped the legacy of these mysterious doctors. The year was 1347, and Europe was on the brink of devastation. The Black Death, an unstoppable force, began its slow crawl across the continent, leaving death in its wake. In just a few short years, the plague would kill between 25 and 50% of Europe's population, shattering entire communities and reshaping the world forever. But amid this apocalyptic chaos, one question stood out above all others: what could be done? It wasn't long before the first plague doctors appeared. With no understanding of the true cause of the plague, people were left to guess at the source of the disease, and their guesses were varied. Some believed it was a punishment from God, others that it was a curse from witches, and still others feared it was caused by an imbalance of the body's humours. The medical community of the time, largely based on theory and not empirical science, was hopelessly unequipped to deal with a threat of this magnitude. But in their desperation, they turned to the plague doctors, hoping these strange figures might hold the answer. The doctors who were chosen to care for the afflicted were given a solemn responsibility, one that would see them stepping into the heart of a crisis that was beyond their control. Appointed by local authorities, these doctors donned their strange beaked masks and full-body robes, becoming the visible symbol of an effort to fight something no one could understand. Despite their appearance, The plague doctors were a product of their time, their work a mixture of trial and error, superstition, and a desperate need for answers. The true terror of the Black Death wasn't just the disease itself, it was the fear of the unknown. Nobody knew how it spread, how to stop it, or even how to treat it. People watched in horror as entire villages were wiped out overnight, their people succumbing to the disease in a matter of days. With no medical knowledge to speak of, the plague doctors turned to whatever remedies they could find. And yet, despite all their efforts, the plague continued its relentless march across Europe. The medical community, crippled by ignorance, could do little but try to manage the panic and fear that accompanied the plague. Quarantine measures were put in place, the sick were isolated, and the dead were disposed of swiftly. The plague doctors, cloaked in their fearsome attire, were the only ones who ventured into the infected areas, searching for a cure amidst chaos. But how much did they truly know about immunity? Could there have been a deeper understanding hiding beneath the surface, something that modern science has yet to fully uncover? The truth may be far more elusive than we think. As the plague ravaged Europe, what if the plague doctors weren't just fighting a disease? They were unknowingly fighting for the survival of a long-forgotten idea about immunity. In the chaos of their time, they may have held clues that modern medicine is only just beginning to uncover. There is no image more enduring in the history of pandemics than the plague doctor, with their long beaked mask and dark, ominous robes. To the modern eye, the beak appears almost comical, a strange relic of a bygone era. Yet, to the people of the 14th and 15th centuries, it was a symbol of hope in the face of despair. But why did these doctors wear such peculiar masks? And what did they believe they were doing to protect themselves and the people they treated? The beaked mask, stuffed with aromatic herbs, spices, and vinegar-soaked rags, was thought to purify the bad air, or miasma, believed to carry disease. The longer the mask, the more air it could filter, offering a semblance of safety in a world gripped by disease. But was there more to these masks than just superstition? Could it be that these doctors, in their misguided understanding of infection, were on the cusp of a deeper truth? What seems like an absurd treatment today may have had more grounding in early practices of disease control than we realize. The herbs they used, lavender, rosemary, and juniper, though primitive by modern standards, have medicinal properties that, when used in the right context, can provide some degree of protection. In fact, many of these plants were used in ancient medicine to purify the air, and their use by the plague doctors may not have been as nonsensical as it appears. Could they have understood on some level the importance of preventing infection through the air, even if they lacked the scientific knowledge to explain it? The remedies the plague doctors employed, bloodletting, herbal treatments, and the burning of incense, seem strange and ineffective today. But these practices, though rooted in the limited medical knowledge of the time, were attempts at alleviating symptoms and controlling the spread of disease. They weren't just fumbling in the dark. They were grasping at straws in a world with no understanding of pathogens, germs, or the immune system. And yet, could there have been an ancient wisdom guiding their decisions, a knowledge that was lost, dismissed, or overlooked over time? As strange as their methods may seem, these practices were the first step in understanding immunity and disease prevention. Perhaps it wasn't just the mask or the herbs that mattered, but the underlying idea that disease could be controlled. Could the plague doctors have known more about immunity than we give them credit for? Were their methods rooted in a forgotten tradition of disease prevention that was later erased from history? And so, as the plague doctors treated the sick and watched countless others succumb, their tools, however primitive, may have been the first glimmer of a truth that has since been obscured. Their strange remedies and peculiar attire, though driven by superstition, might hold the key to a deeper understanding of how we fight disease, one that we've quietly forgotten, only to rediscover in the modern age. In the medieval world, a cloud of fear and mystery loomed over the people. It wasn't just the unrelenting threat of the plague, it was the very air around them. Imagine walking through the streets of 14th century Europe, the stench of decay in the air, the heavy atmosphere that seemed to carry the invisible weight of sickness. To many, this was the true culprit of disease. The concept of bad air, or miasma, was deeply ingrained in the medical thinking of the time. People believed that sickness was spread through this foul air, emanating from decaying bodies, swamps, and filth. And the plague doctors, cloaked in their iconic masks, embodied this belief. After all, the plague seemed to strike out of nowhere, spreading in a way that felt connected to the very breath they took. Miasma theory had roots in ancient Greek medicine, but it found new life during the plague years. The plague doctors, unable to see germs or viruses, relied on this theory to form their practices. They thought that by purifying the air with herbs, incense, and other aromatic substances, they could ward off the bad air, and thus the disease. The beaked masks they wore were designed to keep their faces away from the supposed miasma, and were filled with a mix of fragrant herbs, lavender, rosemary, juniper, all believed to purify the air and shield the doctor from the deadly atmosphere. While the modern world views miasma theory as an error, it wasn't entirely unfounded. There was, in fact, a kernel of truth within it, even if medieval doctors were unaware of the existence of bacteria or viruses. It would take centuries for science to uncover the real mechanisms behind disease transmission. But what if the concept of miasma wasn't completely off the mark? What if, hidden beneath the surface of a mistaken theory, there was something important about the air we breathe and how it interacts with our health? Today, we know that certain pathogens can spread through the air, particularly in respiratory illnesses. Could the belief in bad air have been a primitive, instinctual grasp at the truth, a precursor to the airborne virus theory that we now understand? The more we dig into this, the clearer it becomes. The plague doctors weren't just erratic figures of superstition. They were people struggling to understand a world far beyond their medical comprehension, yet still searching for ways to protect themselves and the people they served. So, what if their practices weren't as misguided as we thought? What if their belief in miasma points to a deeper understanding of immunity that we've quietly erased from history? As we look at the limitations of the miasma theory, we'll start to see how later developments in germ theory took over. But the lingering question remains: how much of what they thought they knew about disease was grounded in something real? What truths were hidden beneath their misunderstood practices? In the midst of medieval Europe's fight against the plague, it wasn't just the disease itself that plagued their minds. It was the question of why some people lived while others perished. The question that would eventually lead to the study of immunity was already lingering in the air. Though it may not have been understood in modern terms, the idea that the body could somehow resist disease was not entirely foreign to the plague doctors. Their role was not just to treat the sick, but to figure out why some people seemed impervious to the plague, while others succumbed to it. In many ways, the very concept of immunity seems to have been present in medieval practices, albeit in a rudimentary form. Consider the quarantine measures the plague doctors instituted, isolating the sick and keeping them away from healthy people. This idea, though not fully understood, mirrored what we now know about the spread of contagious diseases. These early health measures weren't just about keeping the infected away, but also about protecting those who hadn't yet been exposed to the disease. Could the plague doctors have had an inkling of what we now understand as immunity? What if their decisions to isolate the sick weren't just based on superstition, but were in fact an early recognition of the body's ability to resist disease? Perhaps they were already unknowingly discovering the concept of herd immunity, or the idea that exposure to disease could lead to resistance, even if they didn't know how or why it worked. Their remedies, too, suggest a belief in the body's ability to fight back. Bloodletting, the use of herbs, and even the practice of inoculating people against the plague were attempts, albeit flawed, to help the body defend itself. The very fact that they tried so many methods indicates they were searching for something, a deeper understanding of disease, a way to empower the body to fight back. These practices may have been misguided by modern standards, but they point to a deeper, forgotten understanding of how the body could interact with disease. What if the plague doctors weren't just fumbling in the dark? Could they have had an early, albeit imperfect, grasp of immunity, an understanding of the body's defenses that was far ahead of its time? As we explore the history of immunity and disease resistance, we'll begin to see how these early medical pioneers were more than just victims of their era. They were looking for answers, seeking to understand the body's resilience to disease, even if the science behind it was still centuries away. As the centuries passed and the Renaissance swept through Europe, the world of medicine was transformed. New ideas began to take shape, and scientific thought shifted toward more mechanical, testable theories. It was during this time that much of the knowledge that the plague doctors had gathered, however imperfectly, was slowly pushed aside. The rise of new scientific methods and the development of modern medical theory led to the marginalization of older, more intuitive practices. Theories about immunity, about the body's ability to fend off disease, were discarded as the focus turned toward dissecting the body, testing hypotheses, and searching for a more concrete, material understanding of health. But why did we erase this knowledge? Why did we forget the practices of the plague doctors who, despite their limitations, had a profound impact on how we approach disease today? The answer may lie in the culture of progress that came with the Renaissance. New, more rational ideas took center stage, and the old methods, often based on experience, intuition, and trial, were relegated to the shadows. But in casting aside these older theories, were we also throwing away vital pieces of understanding that could have shaped the future of medicine in a completely different way? The progress of modern science, with its focus on microbiology and germ theory, naturally overshadowed the ancient and medieval practices that didn't align with the new worldview. But by doing so, we may have missed something that could have filled the gaps in our understanding of immunity. The work of the plague doctors wasn't without merit. It was, in many ways, a precursor to the discoveries of modern medicine. Could there have been a moment in history when knowledge about immunity was forgotten, that we lost an opportunity to fully understand how diseases spread and how we could protect ourselves? The cultural and political forces at play during the rise of scientific inquiry may have hastened the erasure of these older ideas. But as we look back on them, we start to see that the plague doctors, with their beaked masks and strange remedies, might have been holding pieces of the puzzle we're still trying to complete today. As we move forward, we'll begin to see how some of these lost ideas have resurfaced in unexpected ways, hinting that perhaps the knowledge of the past, however forgotten, may still hold answers to the medical mysteries of the future. The Renaissance, a time of intellectual awakening, marked a seismic shift in the way humanity perceived itself and the world. As scholars rediscovered the works of ancient Greek and Roman thinkers, a renewed curiosity blossomed, one that sought not only to understand the world through the lens of reason, but also to reclaim the lost knowledge of antiquity. In medicine, this intellectual rebirth became the foundation for modern understanding, yet it was also a time of contradictions. Medieval ideas about disease, such as the miasma theory, where bad air was thought to spread illness, still held sway. However, with the rediscovery of classical texts, Renaissance thinkers began to look at the human body not as a divine enigma, but as a system that could be understood through observation and empirical study. Early anatomists like Andreas Vesalius used dissection to reveal the inner workings of the body, challenging centuries of dogma. In the process, they set the stage for medical discoveries that would eventually lead to a clearer understanding of immunity. While the Renaissance did not immediately offer answers to the mysteries of disease, it began to question the assumptions that had governed medicine for centuries. By returning to ancient texts, scholars unearthed the wisdom of Hippocrates and Galen, and though many of their ideas were flawed by modern standards, they sparked new ways of thinking about health, illness, and the body's defenses. The Renaissance's re-engagement with classical thought ignited an intellectual revolution in medicine, laying the groundwork for breakthroughs that would follow. But could it be that this Renaissance wasn't merely a revival of old ideas? What if, in the process of rediscovering ancient knowledge, Renaissance scholars unknowingly touched upon deeper truths, forgotten wisdom about immunity and the nature of disease that the plague doctors of the medieval era had glimpsed, but could never fully comprehend? As we explore how these early physicians began to build on the rudimentary understanding of immunity that the plague doctors had hinted at, we begin to uncover a deeper connection between ancient wisdom and modern science. The Renaissance didn't just rebuild the past, it set the stage for a future where knowledge about immunity would evolve, often drawing from the very ideas that had once been dismissed. In the dark corners of history, buried beneath centuries of medical ignorance and superstition, there lies a connection between the practices of the plague doctors and the modern understanding of immunity. The medieval world, ravaged by the Black Death and other plagues, was not entirely blind to the concept of disease control. While they didn't have the technology or scientific framework we do today, they understood the necessity of keeping people isolated, of separating the sick from the healthy. And in their imperfect, albeit rudimentary methods, they began to grasp something crucial: disease transmission. The practice of quarantine, introduced during outbreaks, was one of the earliest forms of controlling the spread of infection. The plague doctors, recognizing that the disease often spread quickly in densely populated areas, urged isolation. This understanding, although not fully explained, was rooted in the instinctive recognition that keeping people apart could prevent the spread of illness, an idea that would eventually shape the development of modern immunology. The plague doctors also began to develop the first rudimentary forms of disease prevention. They didn't understand germs or viruses, but they understood that some form of defense was needed. They relied on herbal concoctions, fumigation, and other practices designed to protect the body's defenses. While their methods seem bizarre by today's standards, herbs in beaked masks, bloodletting, and pungent incense, these actions were based on a raw understanding of the body's vulnerability and its need to be protected. But here's the twist. Could it be that the practices of quarantine and isolation, as well as early forms of inoculation, were the first steps toward the immunological practices we take for granted today? These early medical strategies, once dismissed as primitive, laid the groundwork for modern medicine. Vaccination, for example, would not have been possible without the foundational concept that the body could defend itself against disease. Today, we marvel at the ingenuity of the plague doctors, whose practices, while misguided, were rooted in an intuitive understanding of immunity. Perhaps without realizing it, these early medical pioneers were drawing from a deep well of knowledge about how disease interacts with the body, knowledge that modern science would uncover centuries later. As we explore these connections, we begin to see the clear link between the ancient, medieval, and modern worlds. The practices that began as superstitions and trial and error experiments eventually evolved into the scientific methods we now use to combat disease. In the 19th century, a breakthrough would shatter the foundations of centuries-old medical theories, including the ideas held by the plague doctors. Germ theory, developed by pioneers like Louis Pasteur and Robert Koch, revolutionized our understanding of disease. It replaced the antiquated notion of miasma with the idea that microorganisms, bacteria, viruses, and germs were the true culprits behind illness. Yet, as we look back on the work of the plague doctors, we can't help but wonder, were they so far off the mark? Their understanding of disease spread, though rooted in superstition, was not entirely without merit. The doctors were acutely aware that disease could spread through human contact and air, even if they didn't know about the microbes responsible. While their theories were incorrect, the plague doctors were on the edge of a discovery that would change everything. As the new science of germ theory emerged, it shifted the focus from bad air to microscopic organisms. This shift led to groundbreaking advances in medicine, including sterilization, vaccinations, and antibiotics. However, in this march of progress, ancient wisdom, once thought primitive, was pushed aside. The plague doctors, despite their limitations, had intuited some of the same principles that Pasteur and Koch would prove a century later. They understood that disease could be controlled and spread by forces beyond human control, even if their reasoning was wrong. What if the plague doctors weren't entirely wrong? What if they had unknowingly stumbled upon some of the same principles that germ theory would later confirm? Could their strange methods of disease control, their reliance on isolation and prevention, have been the first inkling of a much greater truth? As we delve into the rise of germ theory, we begin to see how even the flawed practices of the plague doctors paved the way for the medical advances that followed. They were the bridge between an era of superstition and the era of science, and their mistakes might have brought us closer to the truth than we ever realized. Today, as modern medicine continues to advance, we sometimes overlook the forgotten knowledge that came before. But in revisiting the practices of the plague doctors, we can see that the road to understanding immunity and disease control is more complex and more connected to the past than we might have imagined. And in the process, we may just uncover a deeper truth about how we fight disease today. In the annals of early medical history, one glaring absence stands out: the concept of immunity. Though medieval and ancient scholars certainly recognized the impact of infections and even noted the survival of some individuals after exposure to diseases, the idea that the body could actively defend itself against illness remained largely elusive. It was a mystery veiled by superstition, mystical beliefs, and the lack of scientific understanding that would not come for centuries. The plague doctors of the Middle Ages, for example, were keenly aware that some people survived the plague while others did not. They watched in helpless wonder as whole families were wiped out by the disease, while others seemed to escape the worst of its effects. But rather than understanding immunity as we do today, medieval doctors attributed this difference to divine intervention or the strength of the individual's humours. Their medical texts, filled with references to astrology and religious influence, offered no formalized idea of immunity, just vague concepts of balance, purification, and spiritual protection. In ancient texts, the idea of the body's defense against disease is more often implied than explicitly stated. Physicians like Hippocrates and Galen understood that the body fought off illness, but their explanations were grounded in the belief that health came from the balance of bodily fluids, rather than any inherent immune system. Even during the height of the plague, the most learned minds could only offer theories rooted in miasma or divine retribution. And yet, in these very writings, some early hints of what would later be understood as immunity can be found. The belief in contagion, for example, suggests a primitive grasp of how diseases could spread from person to person, though the mechanisms remained unknown. It's fascinating to consider how close they may have come to understanding immunity. In their desperation, medieval doctors focused their efforts on preventing illness through quarantines, isolation, and fumigation, methods that, at their core, seem intuitively linked to the idea of avoiding infection to avoid disease. The real mystery, however, lies in why these practices and insights, despite their potential, were never developed further at the time. Why was the concept of immunity so absent in these texts, despite the fact that it seemed almost within reach? What if, in their search for answers, the plague doctors and their predecessors were unknowingly touching upon something greater than they understood? Could their practices and observations about the spread of disease hold the key to a forgotten understanding of immunity? The answers to these questions might lie hidden within the rich history of ancient and medieval medicine, waiting to be uncovered. As we explore how the evolution of medical knowledge moved beyond these early limitations, we begin to see how the Renaissance and later scientific breakthroughs started to address the void in immunity, offering us the clues that these early doctors might have missed. While immunity was largely absent from the medical discourse of early Europe, there existed practices, albeit primitive, that hinted at a deeper understanding of how the body could defend itself against disease. Perhaps the most intriguing example of this is the practice of smallpox inoculation, which, although rudimentary, marked the beginning of a global awareness of immunity. In the 18th century, long before Edward Jenner's groundbreaking work on vaccination, regions like the Ottoman Empire and parts of Africa had already been practicing methods of inoculation against smallpox. This was a direct attempt to provoke immunity in the body, though not fully understood. Inoculation involved introducing a small amount of the disease to a healthy person, either through the skin or through inhalation, to induce a mild case of the illness. The idea was simple. Once the body fought off the infection, it would develop resistance to future outbreaks of the disease. The practice of inoculation is thought to have ancient origins, potentially linked to medieval understandings of disease and infection. The idea of deliberately exposing a person to disease wasn't as foreign as it might seem. In fact, the medieval practice of quarantine and isolation may have been an early, albeit unscientific, form of preventing reinfection after a person recovered. But the evolution of inoculation across cultures during the 18th century was crucial, as it laid the groundwork for what we now understand as vaccination. What's fascinating here is that these early methods of inoculation, though not scientifically validated at the time, were still rooted in an instinctive understanding of immunity. The practices in Africa and the Ottoman Empire predated Jenner's discovery by centuries, and yet, in many ways, they pointed to the same fundamental principles. The body could be made to fight a disease by exposing it to a controlled amount of that disease. In a way, they were laying the foundation for modern vaccination, using a method based more on trial and error than on scientific principles. What if these early methods of inoculation were not just random practices, but part of a greater understanding of how immunity works? An understanding that, despite being lost to time, was still embedded in the practices of different cultures. Could these ancient practices have influenced later vaccine development, albeit indirectly? As we transition into the story of how vaccines evolved into a science-based practice, we begin to see how these early forms of immunization paved the way for Jenner and others, offering a clear link between ancient methods and the modern vaccines we rely on today. The 18th century saw the birth of a revolutionary idea that would change the course of medicine forever: vaccination. But it wasn't as sudden a breakthrough as it might seem. In fact, the very practices of inoculation from centuries earlier would play a pivotal role in shaping the modern understanding of immunity. And as we look at the rise of vaccination, we must ask, was the groundwork for this discovery laid centuries earlier by practices and knowledge that had been forgotten, misunderstood, or dismissed? In 1796, Edward Jenner's experiments with cowpox led to the development of the first smallpox vaccine. Jenner's discovery was groundbreaking, and it provided the first concrete scientific evidence that a person could be protected from a disease by exposure to a similar but milder form of it. The success of Jenner's vaccine transformed global health, leading to the eventual eradication of smallpox in the 20th century. But the key to Jenner's success lay in an idea that was as old as human history: immunity. What if Jenner's discovery was less a sudden revelation and more a natural progression of ideas that had been bubbling under the surface for centuries? The idea of immunity, though not fully recognized in the 18th century, was rooted in practices like inoculation, practices that had been used by various cultures long before Jenner's time. Even the ancient methods of the plague doctors, with their focus on isolation, quarantine, and the prevention of disease spread, contained early clues that, when pieced together, formed the foundation for modern immunology. In many ways, the vaccine revolution represents the moment when ancient practices, once dismissed as superstition, were brought into the scientific fold. The development of vaccines, based on Jenner's work and the understanding of immunity, was a triumph of science, yet it was built upon knowledge that had existed in various forms for centuries. The impact of vaccines on public health cannot be overstated. Today, vaccines are one of the most powerful tools in our arsenal against infectious diseases, and the success of the smallpox vaccine paved the way for the development of vaccines for polio, measles, and countless other diseases. But as we stand on the shoulders of giants like Jenner, we must also acknowledge the forgotten wisdom of those who came before him: the plague doctors, the ancient civilizations, and the early pioneers of inoculation, whose practices, though rudimentary, contributed to our modern understanding of immunity. In the next section, we will explore how the legacy of these early ideas continues to influence modern medicine and our approach to disease prevention today. Could the rediscovery of ancient knowledge hold the key to fighting the diseases of the future? Only time will tell. Quarantine, a term so familiar to modern ears, especially in the wake of the COVID-19 pandemic, has its origins in a far earlier period of human history. Long before the scientific underpinnings of disease transmission were understood, medieval doctors and authorities devised isolation measures to combat the spread of the plague. The word quarantine itself comes from the Italian 40 giorni, meaning 40 days, the amount of time ships were required to remain isolated in port during the Black Death to ensure they weren't carrying the disease. While these early quarantine practices were based more on fear than on any scientific knowledge of bacteria or viruses, they served a fundamental purpose: limiting the spread of disease. In the midst of the horrific outbreaks of the 14th century, when entire villages and towns would be decimated by the plague, isolation was the only tool available. Infected individuals or those suspected of carrying the disease were isolated in designated plague houses, and entire areas would be cordoned off to prevent the sick from mingling with the healthy. While it might seem rudimentary by today's standards, this was a pioneering approach to disease control. The practices of medieval quarantine set the stage for the development of modern public health measures. Over the centuries, as our understanding of disease and transmission evolved, quarantine measures became more systematic, forming the backbone of the public health infrastructure we rely on today. Today, we know that diseases spread through various vectors, bacteria, viruses, and other pathogens. But the essence of quarantine as a means of halting the spread of infection can be traced directly to those early efforts during the plague. What if the concept of quarantine wasn't just a reaction to the plague, but the first sparks of a global strategy that would shape public health for centuries? Could these medieval measures have provided the first clues about how to fight global pandemics in the modern world? The lineage of quarantine measures from medieval times to modern-day public health strategies shows just how deeply ancient practices have influenced the way we respond to infectious diseases. As we move forward, we see that the practices of isolation and containment didn't end with the fall of the medieval era. They evolved into more refined, systematic measures, paving the way for how we fight disease today. In the wake of the plague, the focus on isolating the sick grew, but it didn't stop there. As medieval doctors grappled with the relentless spread of the Black Death, they began to notice patterns. Though they lacked modern tools like microscopes and diagnostic tests, they were keen observers of the world around them. They began to identify the high-risk areas, tracking where outbreaks occurred and who was most likely to contract the disease. The connection between proximity, movement, and disease was being recognized, albeit without the science to back it up. This trial-and-error approach to disease control laid the foundation for what would eventually become epidemiology, the science of tracking and controlling disease spread. Early efforts at quarantine, though not based on an understanding of pathogens, had a practical effect. Authorities began to document the movement of disease, understanding that it spread along trade routes, through crowded towns, and in families living in close quarters. They identified high-risk groups, including those living in unsanitary conditions or those who came into contact with infected individuals. In many ways, the medieval efforts at disease tracking were the first inkling of what would eventually evolve into modern epidemiology. These early doctors didn't know about bacteria or viruses, but they understood that controlling the movement of infected individuals was a key strategy for containing outbreaks. By isolating the infected, tracking the spread, and even documenting the geographic and social patterns of disease, they laid the groundwork for the science of disease control. What if these medieval doctors, despite their limited knowledge, were the unwitting pioneers of modern epidemiology? Their observations and methods, refined over centuries, became the backbone of the science we now use to combat pandemics. In essence, the medieval response to the plague offered the first crude but effective methods for understanding and managing the spread of disease, a foundation upon which modern epidemiology would be built. As we continue, we'll explore how these early efforts were honed and expanded, eventually giving rise to the sophisticated epidemiological methods used to track and manage diseases today. While medieval doctors' practices laid the groundwork for disease management, it wasn't until the rise of modern microbiology that the true mechanisms behind immunity were revealed. The discovery of bacteria, viruses, and pathogens opened up a new era of medicine, one that would change our understanding of immunity forever. Louis Pasteur and Robert Koch, pioneers in microbiology, revolutionized the way we viewed disease and the human immune system. Pasteur's development of the germ theory of disease in the 19th century provided the missing link that medieval medicine lacked. No longer were diseases blamed on bad air or divine punishment. They were now understood to be caused by tiny organisms that could be controlled and prevented. Pasteur's work with vaccines and Koch's identification of specific pathogens laid the foundation for the modern understanding of immunology. The breakthrough that changed everything was the identification of pathogens, microorganisms capable of causing disease. Armed with this knowledge, scientists began to understand how the immune system responds to foreign invaders. They discovered that the body's defenses, such as antibodies and white blood cells, work to neutralize and destroy harmful pathogens. This was the scientific understanding of immunity that had eluded the medieval world. But the fascinating part of this story is how these ancient practices, including quarantine and the rudimentary idea of inoculation, seem to coincide with the discovery of germs and immunity. The quarantine measures of the medieval era, though rooted in superstition, were a precursor to the concept of isolating infected individuals to prevent disease spread, something that Pasteur and Koch would later affirm with the germ theory. Could it be that the true breakthrough in immunity came not from the medieval trial and error methods, but from a deeper revolution, the discovery of pathogens themselves? What if the ancient practices of disease control, including the use of quarantine and isolation, were unwittingly aligned with the modern understanding of how immunity functions? By combining the observations of medieval doctors with the discoveries of modern microbiology, we begin to see how immunity emerged as a science, not as an abstract concept, but as a biological process that could be understood and manipulated. As we move into the final chapter, we'll look at how these discoveries in microbiology and immunology reshaped modern public health and disease prevention, giving rise to the vaccines, treatments, and strategies that are used today. In 1796, a discovery that would forever change the course of medicine was made by an unlikely figure, Edward Jenner, an English physician. Jenner's pioneering work in smallpox vaccination was not just a breakthrough in medical science, but a monumental shift in the way humans understood immunity. While Jenner's discovery was groundbreaking, its origins were grounded in practices that had been observed centuries earlier, particularly in the practice of variolation. Variolation, the practice of deliberately exposing a person to the virus by infecting them with a mild case of smallpox, had been used in Asia and parts of Africa for centuries. The idea was simple, yet profound. If you survived a mild version of the disease, your body would develop immunity against the more serious, deadly form. This concept of controlled exposure seemed to echo the ancient practices of medieval medicine, where exposure to disease was often seen as a way of building resilience. While variolation was far from perfect, it sometimes led to full-blown smallpox. Its core idea was a crucial step in the journey toward understanding immunity. Jenner, inspired by the practice of variolation, made a remarkable connection. He noticed that milkmaids who had contracted cowpox, a milder disease, seemed to be immune to smallpox. By testing his theory, Jenner successfully inoculated a young boy with cowpox and then exposed him to smallpox. The boy did not fall ill. Jenner's insight was revolutionary. By introducing a weakened form of the virus into the body, a person could build immunity against the deadly version of the disease. This discovery set the stage for modern vaccination. Jenner's work marked the beginning of the idea that immunity could be actively induced, rather than passively acquired through infection. But what if Jenner's discovery wasn't a complete break from earlier methods? Could the practices of medieval doctors, who had used exposure and isolation to manage disease, have provided the foundation for Jenner's work, even if they didn't fully understand the science behind it? As we move forward, the impact of Jenner's work would lay the groundwork for an explosion of vaccination research and development, pushing the boundaries of immunity and public health. Vaccination, as conceived by Edward Jenner, was a monumental leap forward. But how does it work, and why does it have the power to prevent diseases that once devastated populations? In this section, we will delve into the science behind vaccination and how it builds immunity within the human body. When a vaccine is introduced into the body, whether it contains a weakened form of the virus, a dead virus, or just a part of the virus, it activates the body's immune system. The immune system reacts to the foreign substance, producing antibodies that specifically target the virus or bacteria. These antibodies are then stored in the body, creating memory cells. These cells are like sentinels, waiting for future encounters with the pathogen. If the person is exposed to the actual disease later, the immune system recognizes the threat immediately and can launch a faster, more effective defense. The beauty of this process is that it doesn't require the individual to suffer the full effects of the disease. Instead of becoming ill from the virus itself, the body gets a sneak peek, an introduction to the pathogen without the harm. This method of preparing the immune system is the essence of what makes vaccines so effective. Modern vaccines are responsible for eradicating or nearly eliminating some of the deadliest diseases in history, including smallpox, polio, and measles. The legacy of Jenner's work can be seen in these modern marvels, which have saved millions of lives worldwide. But how did we get from Jenner's first trial to the sophisticated vaccines we use today? How did these early discoveries lead to the development of vaccines for diseases like polio, influenza, and hepatitis? Understanding the science behind vaccines is key to appreciating their role in modern medicine. While the foundational concept remains the same, exposing the immune system to a controlled version of the pathogen, the technology and understanding behind vaccines have advanced significantly. The impact of vaccination on public health cannot be overstated, as it has reduced global mortality and prevented pandemics. As we continue, we'll explore the global impact of vaccines, focusing on their role in transforming medicine and saving lives across the world. The story of vaccines is not just about science. It's about the lives saved, the diseases eradicated, and the progress made in public health. The global impact of vaccines has been nothing short of transformative. Diseases that once ravaged populations, smallpox, polio, and measles, are now either eradicated or under control, thanks to the power of vaccination. Smallpox, the first disease to be eradicated through vaccination, stands as a testament to the power of immunization. In 1980, the World Health Organization, WHO, declared smallpox eradicated after years of global vaccination efforts. This was the first time in history that a disease had been completely wiped out through human intervention. The global effort to eradicate smallpox was one of the most significant achievements in the history of medicine. Polio is another success story. Thanks to the widespread use of the polio vaccine, the number of polio cases has dropped by more than 99% since the 1980s. Polio, once a global threat that caused paralysis and death, is now only a concern in a handful of countries. This success has laid the groundwork for future efforts to eradicate other diseases. The legacy of vaccines extends beyond just these two examples. Vaccines have dramatically reduced the prevalence of diseases like hepatitis, rotavirus, and diphtheria. Even the seasonal flu, which continues to cause illness each year, is kept in check by ongoing vaccine development. Vaccines are also at the forefront of the battle against new diseases, such as the COVID-19 pandemic, where vaccine development has provided a global solution to a rapidly spreading disease. Vaccination's global impact is felt not only in the lives saved, but also in the way public health systems have evolved. International health organizations like the WHO, alongside local governments and healthcare providers, have worked together to promote immunization worldwide. Through initiatives like the Global Vaccine Safety Initiative and the Gavi Alliance, vaccines are distributed to populations in need, particularly in low-income countries, where access to healthcare might otherwise be limited. What if the eradication of smallpox and the near elimination of polio are just the beginning? Could the advances in vaccine technology be the key to tackling future pandemics, just as they have with COVID-19? Vaccines have proven time and again that they are an indispensable part of modern medicine, offering protection against disease and saving countless lives. As we move toward the future, we'll explore the challenges of vaccine distribution, especially in today's interconnected world, and how the next generation of vaccines could further reshape global health. The landscape of vaccine development has undergone a seismic shift in recent years, driven by technological advancements that were once unimaginable. The rapid development of the COVID-19 vaccine, particularly through the use of mRNA technology, demonstrated the incredible potential of modern science to tackle global health crises with unprecedented speed and effectiveness. mRNA vaccines, like the ones developed by Pfizer-BioNTech and Moderna, work by teaching the immune system to recognize and respond to a virus without using the actual virus itself. This method is far quicker than traditional vaccine development, which often requires growing the virus or bacteria in a lab setting. The success of mRNA vaccines in combating COVID-19 has opened the door to a new era of vaccine development. Beyond mRNA, other groundbreaking technologies like gene editing and personalized medicine are on the horizon. The potential to modify genetic material to prevent or treat disease is a fascinating prospect. For instance, scientists are already exploring ways to use CRISPR technology to target the genes responsible for certain diseases, including cancer. Personalized vaccines, tailored specifically to an individual's genetic makeup, could offer a more precise and effective way to fight diseases like cancer, which have been notoriously difficult to treat with traditional methods. But what if the future of vaccines extends beyond infections and into the realm of genetic modification? Imagine a world where vaccines are not just designed to protect us from viruses or bacteria, but are used to alter our DNA to prevent diseases like cancer or Alzheimer's. Could vaccines become the ultimate tool in preventing the diseases that have long been considered incurable? The possibilities are both exhilarating and daunting. The intersection of immunology, genetics, and biotechnology promises a future where vaccines could change not just our immune responses, but the very nature of human health itself. The pace of innovation in vaccine technology raises exciting prospects, but with these new possibilities comes a complex web of questions. How will society handle the ethical challenges of modifying human genetics? What will this mean for global health? And how can we ensure that these advances are accessible to all? These are questions we will explore further as we continue to navigate this brave new world of vaccine development. As vaccine technology advances, so too do the ethical dilemmas surrounding their development and distribution. The global rollout of COVID-19 vaccines highlighted the challenges of ensuring equitable access to life-saving vaccines. While some countries were able to vaccinate large portions of their populations in record time, others struggled with limited access to doses. These disparities in vaccine access were a stark reminder that, despite scientific advancements, global health remains a deeply unequal field. Vaccine nationalism, where wealthy nations stockpile vaccines, has been a major point of contention in discussions about fairness and equity. In addition to distribution challenges, the question of mandatory vaccination raises ethical concerns. While vaccines have proven to be essential in controlling infectious diseases, requiring people to be vaccinated, especially with new technologies, raises questions about personal autonomy and bodily rights. The COVID-19 pandemic reignited these debates, as governments around the world grappled with the balance between public health and individual freedoms. Is it ethical to mandate vaccines for the collective good, or should individuals have the right to refuse? The ethical complexities don't stop there. With the advent of technologies like gene editing, the future of vaccines may not just be about preventing infectious diseases, but altering human genetics. Should we allow genetic modifications that could affect not just the individual, but future generations? What if a vaccine could permanently alter someone's DNA to make them resistant to disease? These are not theoretical questions. They are becoming increasingly real as science progresses. The line between health and enhancement, between prevention and modification, is becoming increasingly blurred. As vaccines continue to evolve, the ethical and logistical challenges surrounding them will only grow more complex. How do we ensure that new technologies are used responsibly and fairly? How do we navigate the tension between innovation and equity, between the promise of better health and the risks of overreach? The answers to these questions will shape not just the future of vaccines, but the future of public health itself. In the next section, we will look at how these ethical and distribution challenges are influencing the development of modern medicine, particularly as new vaccines and immunization strategies continue to emerge. Pandemics are not new phenomena. History is dotted with outbreaks that have ravaged populations, shaped societies, and forced humanity to adapt to the inevitability of infectious disease. Among these, the Black Death of the 14th century stands as one of the most infamous and devastating events in history. Its arrival in Europe in 1347 marked a shift in the way society viewed disease, death, and survival. Over the course of just a few years, it wiped out between 25 to 50% of Europe's population, leaving cities and towns in a state of turmoil. The response to the Black Death, though rudimentary by today's standards, laid the foundation for the strategies used in modern pandemics. While scientists and doctors in medieval Europe did not have the tools or knowledge we possess today, they were quick to recognize the need for measures to contain the spread of disease. Quarantine, isolation, and even early forms of social distancing were implemented in the effort to curb the transmission of the plague. In fact, the very word quarantine originates from the Italian word quaranta, meaning 40, which was the number of days ships suspected of carrying the plague were isolated before being allowed to dock. Fast forward to today, and we find ourselves employing similar strategies in the face of the COVID-19 pandemic. The global use of quarantine, social distancing, and isolation to control viral spread mirrors the medieval practices that were shaped by the unknowns of the time. What's more fascinating is that while medieval medical knowledge was limited, their actions laid the groundwork for modern public health measures. Could it be that we are unknowingly following in the footsteps of the plague doctors and their ancient counterparts? Are we repeating history, not just in our responses to pandemics, but also in the strategies we use to combat them? The eerie similarities between medieval pandemic strategies and modern methods suggest that, while much has changed in medicine and science, the fundamentals of how we address pandemics have remained strikingly consistent. This connection between past and present is worth exploring further, especially as we move into the next section to see how disease control practices evolved over time. In the wake of the Black Death, medieval practices like quarantine began to take root as the cornerstone of public health efforts to control epidemics. The understanding of disease transmission at that time was rudimentary, but the need for isolation was clear. Ships arriving from infected regions were forced into isolation for 40 days before their passengers could disembark. People exhibiting symptoms of plague were confined to their homes, and entire neighborhoods were sometimes sealed off. These early efforts were driven by the belief in miasma, or bad air, but they nonetheless set the stage for more advanced methods in later centuries. As time passed and medical science evolved, so did the methods used to control disease. Quarantine remained a primary tool, but new techniques emerged as societies began to understand disease spread more clearly. By the 19th century, concepts like contact tracing and the identification of disease carriers were becoming integral to the fight against infections. The modern practice of contact tracing, which involves identifying and isolating individuals who may have come into contact with an infected person, has its origins in the quarantine practices of the medieval era. While it's easy to view these measures as primitive or superstitious, they were the forerunners of much more refined strategies used today. During the COVID-19 pandemic, contact tracing became a cornerstone of the global effort to slow the virus's spread. This method, which tracks the movements and interactions of infected individuals, mirrors medieval efforts to isolate and track disease. Although we now understand the true mechanisms of transmission through viruses and bacteria rather than bad air, the basic principle of isolating and tracking those who are infected is deeply rooted in history. These historical disease control strategies demonstrate how societies have always used the tools at their disposal, regardless of their understanding of the science behind them. While quarantine and isolation measures were initially a response to fear and superstition, they evolved over time into the systematic, scientifically grounded methods we now use. The journey from medieval quarantine to modern epidemiological strategies is a story of trial and error, of slowly building a framework of public health that continues to guide us today. As we move into the next section, we'll explore how these methods, rooted in the medieval past, intersected with the development of modern science, especially in the understanding of pathogens and the transition from superstition to germ theory. When the plague doctors donned their iconic beaked masks, they were operating under the belief that disease was caused by miasma, the bad air that emanated from decaying organic matter. This theory, while incorrect, shaped their approach to disease control and was the prevailing explanation for centuries. But as the centuries progressed, the understanding of disease would undergo a radical transformation, from the miasma theory to the groundbreaking germ theory, which would revolutionize medicine forever. The shift from miasma to germ theory is one of the most significant advancements in the history of public health. In the mid-19th century, the work of scientists like Louis Pasteur and Robert Koch began to challenge the centuries-old beliefs about disease transmission. Pasteur's work on fermentation and germ theory laid the foundation for the understanding that microorganisms, bacteria, viruses, and fungi were responsible for many diseases. Koch, building on Pasteur's work, was able to establish a direct link between specific pathogens and specific diseases, such as tuberculosis and cholera. While miasma theory was rooted in the observation of disease clusters, it mistakenly attributed these outbreaks to bad air, rather than understanding that microorganisms were the true culprits. The medieval response to the Black Death, which focused on isolation and quarantine, was based on this flawed theory. Yet, despite the inaccuracies, the measures themselves were not entirely ineffective. In fact, as we know today, quarantine and isolation have proven to be essential tools in disease control, especially for contagious diseases like COVID-19. The transition from miasma to germ theory was not an instantaneous one, and for a long time these two ideas coexisted. The acceptance of germ theory didn't immediately replace the old ways of thinking, but as the scientific method gained ground, The more empirical, evidence-based approach to disease began to dominate. This new understanding of pathogens led to the development of vaccines, antibiotics, and better public health infrastructure. The importance of germ theory cannot be overstated. It reshaped how we understand disease, immunity, and transmission. However, the history of pandemics also shows us that even in the absence of scientific knowledge, the basic human instinct to protect communities and isolate the infected has endured across centuries. What was once driven by superstition and fear has evolved into a sophisticated system of disease management backed by science. As we move forward, we'll explore how these centuries-old practices are still used today, shaping the global responses to modern pandemics, and how our evolving understanding of pathogens continues to inform public health strategies in the fight against disease. The COVID-19 pandemic shook the world to its core. But amid the chaos, a new chapter in the history of medicine was written. The rapid development of the COVID-19 vaccine was nothing short of miraculous, a triumph of science, collaboration, and sheer human determination. Within a year of the virus's emergence, researchers developed vaccines that have not only saved millions of lives, but have forever changed our understanding of how we can prevent disease. At the heart of this breakthrough was the use of mRNA technology, an innovation that had been in development for decades. mRNA vaccines work by instructing the body's cells to produce a protein similar to the virus's spike protein, prompting an immune response. When the body encounters the real virus, it is already equipped with the necessary defenses. This technology, though revolutionary, is built on centuries of research into the immune system, viruses, and vaccine development. It represents the culmination of efforts that stretch back to Edward Jenner's smallpox vaccine, the discoveries of Louis Pasteur and Robert Koch, and the advances in microbiology and immunology that followed. The rapid development of the COVID-19 vaccine not only demonstrated the speed at which modern science could operate, but also the power of global cooperation. Scientists, pharmaceutical companies, and governments came together to meet an unprecedented challenge, drawing upon knowledge and resources accumulated over centuries. And yet, as remarkable as this feat was, it also raises a deeper question. Could this pandemic have been the final push needed to unlock even greater potential in vaccine technology and immunology? The COVID-19 vaccine is not just a victory over a virus, but a window into the future of how we might tackle some of humanity's most persistent health challenges. As we look forward, the next frontier of vaccine development beckons. If mRNA technology can protect us against one virus, what's stopping it from protecting us against others? Can this same technology be harnessed to prevent diseases that have long eluded a cure, like cancer or HIV? The future of immunity is full of possibilities, and the foundation laid by the COVID-19 vaccine could be the key to unlocking the next medical revolution. The promise of vaccines has always been about prevention, but the future of immunology goes far beyond infectious diseases. What if vaccines could protect us from cancer, Alzheimer's, or even genetic conditions that run through our families? Today, the frontier of vaccine development is not just about stopping viruses. It's about harnessing the power of our immune system to prevent a wider range of diseases. One of the most exciting areas of research in the 21st century is cancer vaccines. These vaccines aim to prime the immune system to recognize and fight cancer cells, much like how vaccines against infectious diseases work. Researchers are investigating how to use vaccines to prevent the development of certain types of cancer, like cervical or liver cancer, by targeting specific viruses like the human papillomavirus, HPV, or hepatitis B. These vaccines don't just aim to prevent infection, they aim to stop cancer before it even starts. But the real future of immunity lies in gene therapy, an area that seems to blend the boundaries between medicine and science fiction. Thanks to technologies like CRISPR, researchers now have the ability to edit genes, potentially correcting genetic mutations that cause diseases. Imagine a world where we could rewrite the DNA of individuals to prevent inherited diseases like cystic fibrosis, sickle cell anemia, or Huntington's disease. With gene editing, the possibilities are endless. These advances offer more than hope for the future. They offer a glimpse of a world where we can harness the immune system, not just to fight disease, but to prevent it from ever taking root. Imagine vaccines that not only protect you from viruses, but also prevent cancer, autoimmune diseases, and even genetic disorders. The line between what's possible and what's still out of reach is rapidly shrinking. And as we enter this new era of medicine, we may find that the greatest tools for preserving health are no longer just reactive, but preventive at their core. As we move into the next section, we will explore the ethical considerations of these groundbreaking advancements, especially when it comes to altering the very code of human life itself. With every technological advancement comes a set of ethical questions, and gene editing is no exception. As science pushes the boundaries of what's possible, it forces us to confront deep moral dilemmas about how far we should go in rewriting the genetic code of human life. Could editing a person's genes to prevent disease open the door to a future where we design babies, not just cure diseases? Gene therapy, including technologies like CRISPR, holds incredible promise for disease prevention and treatment. However, the power to edit genes also carries immense responsibility. One of the key ethical questions surrounding gene editing is whether we should alter the human genome to prevent diseases like cancer, heart disease, or genetic disorders. While this could eradicate suffering for countless individuals, it also raises questions about the long-term effects and potential unintended consequences. Could editing the genetic code of future generations have unforeseen impacts on the human race? Another ethical dilemma lies in the use of gene editing for enhancement rather than treatment. If we can edit genes to remove diseases, what stops us from using the same technology to create designer babies with specific traits, intelligence, height, or physical abilities? The idea of creating genetically enhanced humans may seem like science fiction, but as gene editing technologies become more advanced, this possibility becomes increasingly real. Beyond the scientific challenges, there are societal implications to consider. Who should have access to these technologies? In a world where genetic modification could become a reality, there's a risk that only the wealthy would benefit, deepening inequality. As these technologies evolve, we must consider the moral implications of altering the very fabric of life and how we balance innovation with caution. As we approach the final chapter, we are left to wonder how humanity will navigate these complex ethical questions. Will the pursuit of disease prevention and genetic enhancement become a force for good? Or will we find ourselves in uncharted moral waters, faced with questions we aren't prepared to answer? From the Black Death to the COVID-19 pandemic, the battle against disease is one that spans the entirety of human history. The plague doctors of the 14th century stood at the front lines of a devastating epidemic, armed with little more than rudimentary theories and tools. Yet their responses shaped the course of medicine for centuries. As pandemics swept through villages, towns, and empires, the methods they employed, quarantine, isolation, rudimentary vaccination, became the foundation upon which modern medical practices were built. The desperation of the medieval world, facing an invisible enemy that killed without warning, led to some of the earliest forms of disease control, including quarantine and the isolation of the infected. These measures, though imperfect, gave way to the more systematic practices we use today. Quarantine, once a desperate effort based on limited understanding, is now a cornerstone of global public health, employed during outbreaks of infectious diseases like Ebola, SARS, and, more recently, COVID-19. The parallels between these early practices and modern-day interventions are striking, showing how the struggle to manage disease has always relied on both innovation and adaptation. What the plague doctors didn't know about germs and immunity, they compensated for with their relentless efforts to contain disease spread. Their actions laid the groundwork for modern epidemiology, a field that today allows us to trace the path of pathogens, isolate outbreaks, and develop life-saving vaccines. The resilience of these early efforts reminds us that the battle against disease is far from new, and every generation has fought this battle with the knowledge, resources, and tools available to them. The story of disease and immunity is a timeless one, and while the specific tools and theories have evolved, the fundamental goal remains the same: to protect humanity from the ravages of infectious disease. As we continue to face new challenges in public health, the legacy of the plague doctors is ever present, a testament to the ingenuity and determination of those who came before us. The story of medical progress is not one of linear discovery, but rather a continuous thread of innovation, shaped by both ancient wisdom and modern science. As we look at the evolution of immunity, we begin to see how ancient medical practices, often discarded or forgotten, have influenced the breakthroughs of today. What if the greatest advances in modern medicine are not entirely the result of new discoveries, but the rediscovery and refinement of ancient practices? The medieval response to the plague, though primitive by modern standards, contained elements of wisdom that would eventually inform the practices of modern public health. For example, the concept of isolation during outbreaks, the use of rudimentary vaccines, and even quarantine methods were precursors to the complex systems of disease management we now employ worldwide. These early practices, grounded in the desperation of those trying to save lives, laid the foundation for the scientific methods that would emerge centuries later. Modern medicine, while vastly more sophisticated, still relies on the same basic principles that medieval practitioners used. The concept of immunity, now understood through the lens of virology, bacteriology, and immunology, was hinted at by early attempts to control the spread of disease. What the plague doctors didn't know about pathogens and the immune system, we now understand through advanced microbiology and genetics. But their instincts to isolate, prevent, and control disease were spot on, and today's medical advances owe a great deal to these historical efforts. Today's breakthroughs in vaccines, particularly the rapid development of the COVID-19 vaccine, are not just a result of modern science, but of centuries of accumulated knowledge. The fight against diseases like smallpox, polio, and measles has its roots in the trial and error methods of early disease control. As we move forward, we see that the lessons of the past are not only still relevant, they are essential to the continued progress of modern medicine. The history of immunity, from the medieval era to the present day, is a story of innovation built upon the knowledge of the past. Every medical breakthrough is a bridge between ancient practices and the future of global health. This intersection of history and innovation ensures that we continue to build upon the successes and learn from the mistakes of those who came before us. As we stand on the threshold of a new era in medical science, we are faced with the promise of a future where diseases that once ravaged entire populations may no longer be a threat. The story of immunity has evolved from medieval trial and error to the sophisticated gene editing technologies and mRNA vaccines of today. But could we be on the brink of a world where infectious diseases are no longer a major threat to global health? The rapid development of the COVID-19 vaccine in 2020 showcased how far we've come, not just in our understanding of immunity, but in our ability to respond to global health crises. The vaccine's development was unprecedented, but it's only the beginning. Researchers are now exploring ways to prevent diseases that have long eluded science, such as cancer, HIV, and Alzheimer's disease. The possibility of a vaccine that prevents cancer, or gene therapies that alter the very DNA of human beings to eliminate disease, is no longer the stuff of science fiction. It is fast becoming a reality. Imagine a world where we can prevent not just infectious diseases, but genetic disorders that have plagued humanity for centuries. With advancements in CRISPR and gene therapy, we may one day be able to edit our genes to prevent diseases before they even begin. The potential to eradicate hereditary conditions and give future generations the gift of immunity from the start is a possibility that is drawing nearer with every scientific breakthrough. Looking forward, we see a future where disease prevention is no longer a matter of chance, but of choice. The innovations of today, coupled with the ancient wisdom of past generations, could unlock a future free from the scourge of plagues, pandemics, and genetic diseases. The knowledge that we have accumulated over centuries, from the trial and error methods of the plague doctors to the precision of modern gene therapy, has given us the tools to protect humanity in ways that were once unimaginable. The promise of a world free from disease is within our reach. The legacy of immunity is not just a historical curiosity, but a living, breathing part of our future. The past has shaped the present, and the present is now shaping a future where we may one day look back and marvel at how far we have come.